Romanesque, we're talking about the successors of the Roman Empire, those Christians who felt like they were living the ideals of the Roman Empire and continuing in the Roman tradition. Obviously, they did not give themselves the name Romanesque. This is for the sake of art historians and scholars that look back at this era and say they were making work that they felt was in the Roman manner, that they were looking at Roman ruins, they were looking at the ancient buildings of the Roman Republic, of the Roman Empire, and emulated them and imitated them. Here we have the Norman Kingdom. This is around 1100. So at the end of this lecture, we'll talk about the foundation of the Norman Kingdom in 1066 with the famous Battle of Hastings. We have the Kingdom of France, and you can see that even part of France is part of the Norman Empire as well. So Normandy, which comes from the North Sea, the Norse, the Normans, those of the North. And even, I mean, this is such a proliferation of people kind of going back and forth, because even though the Normans usurped the Anglo-Saxons, well, the Anglo-Saxons had German lineage anyways. So this kind of idea of being truly Anglo or English is a bit of a misnomer or a misconception. Anyways, the Holy Roman Empire, the most powerful empire at this time. Look at this large geographical extent here. It takes parts of modern day France, Austria, Poland, even part of Italy, and up into the north, areas that are now Belgium, the Netherlands, and in the north, Kingdom of Denmark, where Norway, Denmark are today. You still had in the 1100s an Islamic influence and region that was under their control, but it's smaller than it had been in the 9th and 10th century. And you have the Leon and Castile kingdom here that is kind of spreading east and south. These purple lines that we see are pilgrimage routes. So during this time in the western part of Germany, the southern part of France, and the northern part of this Kingdom of Castile, which becomes Spain, it is these massive churches that people would flock to from other areas to visit. And what are they visiting? So first we'll look at France and northern Spain. They are going to study and look at and be healed, both physically and spiritually, by these relics. So there was this huge market at this time for holy relics. They would dig people's remains up, save a finger or a hand or a foot, and enclose them in these reliquaries. So a relic is a holy object venerated by worshipers of a holy person. So saint, and this is Saint Foy, aka Saint Faith, from the late 10th century, a reliquary made of gold and silver and jewels. And I love this, if you look close, teeny tiny little cameos. You see those cameos? So, just as you expect with like cameos with a silhouette of a face, this is encrusted with jewels and very valuable object. It had intrinsic value, but it also had socio-spiritual value as well. And there was a lot of care and craftsmanship that would go into these. Now, some of these relics, even through the Gothic era, is what gave the individual churches their credibility. It made them powerful. They would beg, borrow, and steal to get, a king would take over a new area, and it would take that area's relic and then house it in their church. So these things moved from place to place and were very controversial and disputed oftentimes. And it fed into the 13th century with the Holy Crusades, getting objects like parts of the true cross, thorns from Christ's head, that have since been debunked as obviously forgeries, but for the longest time, people really believed in it. But sometimes these are very accurate. Like a martyr dies, they know they're buried somewhere, they dig them up, they cut off their head and they put it in a reliquary. They cut off their hand and put it in a reliquary, so that some of the power and the mysticism, the healing power associated with that saint could then be transferred to the reliquary. The reliquary is what houses the relic and then transferred to us, heals us, guides us. And this is a very famous church. This is Santiago de Compostela in Spain. Has anyone heard of it before? This is very famous. This is called Walking the Way of James. St. James is the pilgrim saint of penance. So in other words, I've done something wrong. I need redemption. I will pray to St. James. My prayers are answered, and that I will be absolved of my sin or my wrongdoing. Because of that, that idea of like having to go through something, a trial or a tribulation, because of that, St. James is known as the saint of pilgrimage, but also of prisons. So a lot of prisons will have altars or churches dedicated to St. James, and sometimes like St. James Infirmary, hospitals for the very sick, the very poor, the outcasts of society. To this day, so this has been a common, since this church was built, and people would go to St. James in Santiago de Compostela, which you can see, this is the major route, and there would be churches, pilgrimage churches along this route as well. So you wouldn't just go from here to here with one destination. You would stop at all these other pilgrimage churches along the way, pay, give donation, and that's how these churches built bigger and bigger, amazing cathedrals and structures. So this became known as Walking the Way of St. James in the 11th century, 12th century, and to this day. I have a couple of friends who do it every couple of years. You end up walking a few hundred miles in mountainous terrain through southern France and northern Spain. And it's interesting because you can stop in some of the same inns, some of the same hostels, in the same churches that people 1,000 years ago were going through. So if one is Catholic, especially a lot of people of Spanish descent, will do the way of St. James. Really cool. And as I mentioned, St. James is known as the pilgrim saint, the saint of redemption as well for those outcasts of society. Here is this is from the Renaissance, the Northern Renaissance. This is a German painter, Albrecht Dürer, from the 16th century, 1516. I'm just showing this because this is cool to show this depiction of St. James looking very much like a gnarly Santa Claus. And on his shoulder, he has a shell, which is his attribute, which shows this concept of him being the pilgrim saint. Because what do we do when we're on a pilgrimage? We're on vacation, we're on a tour. What do? We go to the beach, we get a shell, we take it back, we say, I'm here, but this is where I was there, right? We all do this. We all go to the beach. It's one of my favorite things to do when I'm at a beach, because I really don't like to just sit. I will go search for shells. So this urge of kind of bringing back a souvenir has been with us for millennia. This is a layout for a pilgrimage church, and this is a plan. This is an aerial view of looking at it from above. We have a Latin style cross, curving apse, which would be the front. This is actually where the altar would be. A lot of times people think about the altar here, but these are actually smaller chapels here. So all of these black circles along here and these bigger circles right here are individual chapels that you could go visit while the main service, or even when there were people doing a wedding or a baptism here, you could still walk around the aisles and visit these smaller apse chapels. Okay, so a lot of times people think think about it as like one church, one service. No, there are multiple things going on in this church, and when you see these today, you get this sense when you tour them. I've been in a lot of these Romanesque churches that they were meant for tourists today, like modern tourists, because you could just be walking around this thing on your own and not interrupt anyone that's worshiping in the nave. You could be walking through the aisles. And it's true. That is exactly what they were intended for, but not modern tourists, tourists 1,000 years ago who were pilgrims, who were religious tourists that wanted to tour this church. So here you can see the crossing of the transept here, and the nave altar is here. And this is one of the front of the apse that you could still walk around. There's another aisle that goes all the way around it, and behind it that you could go to these smaller chapels. These chapels get bigger and bigger to the point where they in and of themselves look like the size of a church. You know, our small chapel at Lyon College is about the size of some of these chapels inside of the larger church. There's not a door to get into the chapel. It's just open. And so you could bow at the altar, give an offering, light a candle, say a prayer, and each one would be dedicated to a different family, to a different saint. And a lot of them had relics and reliquaries in them that you could visit as well. Remember, the Renaissance artists felt like most of the arts of the Roman era were lost during the medieval times, that people didn't know how to carve, that people didn't know how to paint during the medieval times, that they didn't know how to make massive sculptures. And this isn't entirely true. This is a very well-known medieval artist. He signed his work. His name is Bernardus Galdenius, and he is working in France. He's well known. He works at many churches, so he gets a reputation. And if we were to dig into the iconography here, that is the writing of the image, what story is being told by this Christ in majesty? Christ in majesty becomes a very powerful metaphor of how those people living during feudal times with feudal lords, living a very difficult subsistence, reliance on the land, very agrarian society, one in which you don't have the kind of prosperity, wealth shared amongst the classes. You have a disparity of income, but you believe in Christ as the king, right? Does this make sense? You're controlled. Say there's vassals and there's lords and there's kings, and maybe you don't agree with your local lord, or you're a serf. You don't believe in the king, and you have issue following his authority, or man, this life is rough, I can't get any breaks. Well, here is the true king. Listen to these kings on earth, but this is the true king. And that could be a really unifying, relatable message to, I think that oftentimes religious iconography changes and it fits the times, it fits the historical context. So when we see Christ in majesty, we can understand a relationship between worshipers and their ideals. So here we see sort of a promise for a better life, a better king, a better kingdom in the afterlife. If I follow my king on this earth, but if I follow the bigger king, I'm going to have a better afterlife. And so here we see a sign of peace by Christ in majesty, serving as a king, barefoot on a throne, wrapped in this amazing robe. You can see one knee is exposed here. Look at this beautiful patterning on the robe itself. there's a sort of blankness on the face, but I think there's also just really a peacefulness that the artist depicts here. There is a halo with a Greek cross on the halo behind him, and this called a mandorla, which is an almond shape full body halo. So this is a beautiful depiction. And the Renaissance artists felt like, these medieval artists really weren't making sculptures. They were connected to the church. They weren't freestanding. You couldn't walk all the way around them. They didn't have a front and a back. They just had a front, but it's still an impressive technical acuity. It's carved of marble, and it is as beautiful as anything that was created during ancient Rome, ancient Greece, and during the Renaissance time as well. So it debunks that idea that these medieval artists were crude and couldn't hang with the Renaissance artists. Remember, I talked about the 4 attributes for the 4 Gospels. We've got the eagle, the lion, the ox, and the angel, representing Matthew, Luke, Mark, and John. I love cloisters. This is an example of a space that would have a spiritual significance. This is at Saint-Pierre in Mousset, which is in France. Monastic life gets very codified and organized. There is a sense of purpose, of organization. Monasteries are some of the most important educational centers. They are producing products not just for themselves, but for the local community. They're stopping points along pilgrimage routes, so people could stay in hotels or inns or hostels inside of these monasteries, and all of them would have massive churches as well that were for not just the monks, but the local community. And powerful abbots in these monasteries would be local leaders as well. So they had a political stake in the local government as well. So these are very important places, and they had a lot of money. They had a lot of wealth, because originally the monks would pool their resources and they would give up their money to the abbey, to the abbot, and then later they produced things to cheese, bread, beer. Some of the best beer in France and Belgium to this day comes to us from abbey. Abbey ales are just made by Trappist monks in northern France and Belgium, are just delicious, amazing. If you're 21, try a Trappist ale. They're amazing. But this created revenue, this created wealth, and they didn't use the wealth on themselves. They used it on their buildings. So it was this like continuous, honestly, cultural campaign to benefit God, to benefit the monks, and to live that contemplative life as opposed to an active life. Live in the spiritual world as opposed to living in the world. And this is a cloister. A cloister is a covered walkway, generally a courtyard. So you might have an open space such as this, like a garden. And then you have a walkway, 4 square, around it, that you can walk continuously, like a meditative labyrinth almost, but it's not really a maze. And in this particular cloister, it has these beautiful columns, single column, double column, single column, alternating. And I think there's a sort of pattern and a repetition to that. So if someone has a rosary and they're doing a prayer and they're like counting almost, they can count and look at the columns. It's a beautiful space. And they have these what's called historiated columns that would be telling biblical stories. And so perhaps you get sidetracked, you're in a prayer, you're contemplating the word of God, and then, I get distracted. I would very easily, I have ADHD, like there's no way as a monk, like I could just focus on this biblical mantra. But then I would look up, I would see the capital as part of this column, and it would have this historical lesson on it. It centers me. It reframes my focus. There is a beautiful recreation of some of these cloisters, and I want to share this with you. This is the Met cloisters in New York City. So for some of you that are going to be going on a trip with me to New York City, we have to go. A lot of people know about the Metropolitan Museum. If you ever go to New York City, ask me for an itinerary. I'll give you the best places to go if you're going to go tour some places. Like, obviously, you got to go to the Guggenheim Museum. You got to go to, check out the Empire State Building, but you should go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The Met is one of the best, the biggest museums in the world, but not many people realize this. There's many locations of the Met. So there's the main location right in Central Park. Go to Central Park, get a hot dog, then afterwards go to the Met, unless you're vegetarian, and go to the Met. And when you enter, they actually, you buy a ticket, and it's good for all locations of the Met. There's like 5 locations: the Met Brewer, the Met cloisters. Not many people know about the Met cloisters. They're a bit of a hike. They're the furthest part, like north in Manhattan, that you can go to, and it's like a 45-minute subway trip. You get off and you're out there. It looks like you're in the middle of it looks like Queens or the Bronx. It's just the very edge of Manhattan, and you see a hill. You walk up the hill to the top. You almost feel like you're lost going through a park. It just feels like you're in the middle of nowhere and you're not in New York City. And then you stumble upon this. This was a eccentric collector in the late 19th, early 20th century, started collecting objects from ruins in Europe, medieval Romanesque churches like we're studying today, and monasteries. As they were being torn down, he would save parts of them and he sent them back, and he built a home out of them, and then later added to it, and then he willed it to the city, and then the city turned it over to the Met. And it's a major museum now. It's amazing. It's got a great art collection, and it has numerous cloisters recreated in this space. So I'll shut up and I'll give you this tour here. We gotta go. Histriated capitals as part of the columns. These are Roman-esque churches that have been dismantled in Europe and reassembled here in New York City in the Met cloisters. It's just amazing space. So beautiful. They have an amazing art collection as well. I've been there. They got a little cafe. You can get lunch and just eat out there. See NYC in the background in the distance. So much. There is no substitute for seeing art in person. It's always rewarding. It's always awe-inspiring. And we can find art anywhere. Art is everywhere. Art is in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. It's in Little Rock. It's in Northwest Arkansas. It's in Batesville. You just got to seek it out and find it. This is an example of a portal. I like to think about these portals as liminal spaces. What is a liminal space? A liminal space is a transition. A liminal space is the kind of space in between. This is here, this is there, this is that space in between. It's a liminal transitional space. And this portal would be the chance for you to sort of center yourself and right yourself before you walk into the church. And a lot of times they were propaganda, they were iconography that would be telling a story. Now, remember, at this time in medieval Europe, very few people could read. The wealthiest elites, the kings, even sometimes the kings couldn't read, the monks, and the priests. That's about it. Tax collectors, some governmental workers could read. There wasn't a massive push for education. So storytelling was definitely oratory and also visual campaigns, a sort of branding, a stamping of this is what you believe. And a lot of them were doom, gloom, and scaring the bejesus out of you, scaring the hell out of you to kind of right yourself. Look at all of these opportunities in this doorway for sculptures, for visual campaigns. The Renaissance artists felt like these artists couldn't carve, but man, they carved the crap out of these spaces. This is a different, this is a portal. This is the same portal, but a different view to show you some of the nomenclature or the identifying characteristics of a portal. So, and you should be able to label this. This is a tremeau. The tremeau is the space in between the doorways, and oftentimes this was decorated with sculpture. These are jambs. So this is a jamb, this is a jamb, this is a jamb. Portals are my jam. This is a jamb, this is a jamb. And those were opportunities for sculptures as well. We know this is a lintel. So we have two posts, and on top, that horizontal beam, that's a lintel. Also an opportunity for a sculptural visual campaign. Then we have what's called the tympanum, new vocab word here. Tympanum is this rounded, roundel, semicircle space, similar to a pediment in Greek temples, where there were sculptures. And this is the second coming of Christ. And we can see that he is in majesty and he is divining whether people are going to be living in heaven or if they're going to be living in hell. So this scared people. This made them take very seriously the ideas in the church. This is an example of a tremeau. Remember, the tremeau is right here. Oh man, I love a tremeau. And here, what do you notice? What stands out to you about this figure? It's a very unique figure, and we don't know who it is. But when a scholar or these Renaissance artists tell us that these medieval artists couldn't sculpt, bullshit. Look at how beautiful this is. And it's surrounded by lions. And we don't know if it's Jeremiah, could be or Isaiah. It is a prophet. It is an Old Testament prophet. So we see the Old Testament as the foundation. Isn't that brilliant? So we have the Old Testament as the foundation here, saints and prophets. And then up here, we have the New Testament, the second coming of Christ. So like foundation, the newness, the heavens, the things closer to the heavens, built on this stronger foundation of the Old Testament. But what stands out to you about this figure? This is Romanesque. This is medieval. Does this fit your expectation of a medieval art piece? Does this fit your expectation of Romanesque, of those who weren't making monumental sculptures, who weren't worried about making things that were aesthetically pleasing or beautiful? This is very interesting. I think it's beautiful. It's dynamic. Look at his legs are crossed. He's sort of doing a chiastic pose here, but he's also crossing his legs, and he's daintily on his tippy toes. It's sort of, we're seeing his feet almost from above, but his body from the side and his head from below. It just elongates. Look at how stretched this is. It is so unique. It sort of physical and metaphysical. It's real and it's surreal. It's hyper real. There's no way. He's so tall and he's filling that true May space, which is a really difficult space to design. You're really given a difficult composition there, and this artist fills it beautifully. The most famous artist during the Romanesque era is this artist, Gislebertus, and he did a sculptural campaign. He did a lot of sculptures for this church called Saint-Lazare in Autun, France. If anyone speaks French, that's my attempt at a French intonation. Forgive me for Martel would be ashamed of me, but I try. This is that same church, Saint-Lazare in Autun, France, and Francois. This is a detail of the Last Judgment. So it's in a tympanum sculpture, similar to this. You can see there's a sort of style and iconography that's really, really similar. And he's working in that metaphor and that language here. You can see the mandorla, you can see the angel surrounding him, the exaggerated form. This is his masterpiece. This is Eve. And what is Saint-Lazare? Saint Lazarus. Lazarus being risen from the dead is a tale of telling us instructional how to live our lives. But this is Eve of Adam and Eve fame, and it tells us a bit about how medieval people felt about the role of Eve and Adam and Eve. Here we see nudity in the church. A couple of you wrote about the Aphrodite of Nitos for your visual analysis. Here we see nudity similar to that on the church. Eve has this tree, though, covering her pelvic. So this looks like a snake. She's slithering through the garden, almost floating, weightless, through this space, plucking a fruit, that forbidden fruit. And look at her hand. Does her hand and her arm, if you cover up her body, resemble a form? It looks snake-like. She looks snake-like. Tell me how you really feel about Eve, Gislebertus. Tell me how you really feel about women, Gislebertus. It's saying that at this time, women can be temptresses. Women can be the fall of man, of men, of man, of humanity, but it's not necessarily biblical. So this would have been a campaign to caution. I mean, me personally, as a kid, I would have been like, oh, look, boobs, but it would have been like, oh, wait, this is a story. This is serious. I gotta know. I should watch out for temptation. I should live my life. And even if I do sin, God is the salvation. Christ is the salvation. Holy Roman Empire, this is in Germany. This is in northern France, Germany, most of Europe, ruled by, as we learned, Charlemagne, the Ottonians. This continues in that tradition. This is the great Spire Cathedral in Germany. You can see an allusion to Roman basilicas, so Romanesque. What are some key characteristics of Romanesque churches? Narrow naves, really, really narrow naves, vaulted spaces, so high ceilings, thick walls, really, really thick walls and columns on the insides, okay? So next chapter, we'll talk about Gothic art and the differences there, but few windows, thick walls, and narrow naves with tall vaulted ceilings. I'm going to skip this. We're going to talk about how Romanesque manifests itself regionally in other places like Italy. This is the very famous cathedral complex in Pisa. The cathedral was begun in 1063, so the same time as the Norman invasion in Italy and in England. The baptistry was started a century later, and the campanile was started a few decades after that. The campanile is the very famous Leaning Tower of Pisa. But look at this beautiful Romanesque church. You can see the transept is laid out in a Latin cross, has a dome. The campanile was separate, just like Giotto's campanile. That we'll see in Florence, and the baptistry is also separate, just like the Florence baptistry. This is the Duomo in Florence next to it, and the baptistry, which is an octagon building, is very medieval, very Romanesque. The Renaissance artists used this church and this church as a model to build their churches that they felt were much more beautiful than Romanesque and Gothic churches, but joke was on them because they were Romanesque churches. And here's me in front of the campanile. Pro tip, there is a museum across the street from right in the same kind of compound as where the cathedral is in Pisa. Go to the museum. It houses all of the original sculptures and relics that were inside of the church. It's now in this museum, and you go to the third floor, which is really, really tall, up for free after you pay your entry fee. There's a great restaurant, and you have the view. That's why I took this selfie of this, the cathedral and the Leaning Tower of Pisa, to yourself. You've got to do that. This is a really interesting church that I could talk on and on about, but it is San Miniato al Monte. Al Monte was a martyr in the early 3rd century. He was a Christian martyr killed by the Romans, and he was beheaded. And the story goes that after he was beheaded, he picked up his head and said, "This is fine," and lived for another month and talked and gave spread the word of Christ. And so this church was built where his remains are, and it's at the top of this hill. This is a great place. If you go to Florence, it's a great place to go. 5 minutes. Time is up. I didn't even get to talk about this. William the Conqueror, Battle of Hastings, Bayeux Tapestry, the size of a football field, only about 2 feet tall, but 230 feet long. Whoa. Individual embroidered scenes on this large scroll telling the story of the Battle of Hastings, the Norman invasion from the Norman perspective. This was King Edward, who was revered by both the Anglo-Saxons and also the Normans, but his successor was Harold. There was a dispute, and William the Conqueror, as who do you think wins there, right? Harold, come on, or William the Conqueror. And so this starts the spread of the Norman Empire. But don't feel too sorry for the Anglo-Saxons, because the Normans were very enamored with Anglo-Saxon culture, and there was still a persistence. This is Westminster Abbey that had been started right prior to this with King Edward. And you can see that Edward the Regis, so it says Edward the Regis, the king, is being buried here, and this was originally called St. Peter's Church here. And you can see God pointing to that church that says that William the Conqueror, who was the successor to Edward and Harold, is divinely appointed. Did you know that Prince Charles is related? No, King Charles today is related indirectly, directly from this change of names to William the Conqueror. He's related to Henry VIII and can follow his lineage all the way from there. I didn't do it as much as I wanted, but I got through a lot of it.